international, hello European policy? I don't know. Anyway, sorry, not very good for my colleagues. But they gave a very nice overview of an analysis they've done looking at EU policy and the level to which the ecosystem service thinking had was integrated or incorporated in EU policy. And they looked at a number of policy sectors, so air, water, soil, regional development, climate adaptation, mitigation, bioenergy, transport, and so on. And first of all, they looked whether there was a conceptual integration of these concepts into these policies. And what they, so they scanned the documents, and what they found with this color coding here is, yes, that in quite a few places, it was conceptually there in a comprehensive and explicit way, although in some things it was lacking. So for example, in transport, there was no mention or no thought about natural capital ecosystem services. But then when you dig a bit deeper and go from the conceptual to the operational integration, so how is it actually put into policy with subsidies and legal requirements, actually there things were a lot less explicit. They were at best implicit and incomprehensive. Maybe a couple of cases explicit, but very, very or generally quite incomprehensive. So there's a big gap there between sort of aspirations and beginning to think in these concepts to the actual policy in the field. So at a conceptual level, things were integrated. Operational integration was limited. So far, the situation, therefore, is far from optimal. And there's a need for further efforts to develop a more comprehensive policy set in Europe. That was sort of the main conclusions that came from their work. The existing places where ecosystem services are used tend to be the traditional sectors. So policy is still quite sectoral, and some of the sectoral policies mention ecosystem services, but there's little of the cross-cutting integration. That has a risk of inappropriate trade-offs if you have things very much focused on specific policy sectors rather than integration where you can compare things properly. That was also related then to the decision support information that was available, and in the end their finding was that actually this sort of lack of integration undermines the EU attempt of having a green economy. So they like to say that Europe will have a green economy in the coming decades, they have targets and so on, but actually before you can achieve that you will need further integration. Now that was interesting at an EU level, but during coffee breaks at that meeting, Sally Thomas came up to Patrick, who presented this, and they started discussing. It was actually a very interesting exercise to also perform for Scotland, to see what is the level of conceptual and operational integration of these concepts in Scottish policy. So luckily we have a student who took that on as a master's dissertation project, and that's Clement, who will be presenting his initial findings and his initial thoughts later on in this session. Before we do that, we start off with Daniel Hinson, who is part of the Scottish Government Natural Capital Group. Maybe he'll say a bit more about his role in that within the Scottish Government. Started his talk, but he'll talk about the big picture and the work of the Scottish Natural Capital Group. That will be followed by Maggie as the second key speaker from the Wildlife Trust, who will talk about a tool that they're developing, a policy tool for integrating natural capital and ecosystem services thinking into spatial planning and into building regulations. And then Clement will show his initial results or ideas for assessing the policy integration in Scotland. So with that, I'd like to give the floor to Daniel,